Welcome back to Mr. News Art Class. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces. This video is a continuation of our series on observational drawing or still life drawing, drawing what you see. And in last week's video, we talked about value scales, how to shade or even use a pen to make hatching or cross-hatching or stipple. That value creation is one of the main fundamental processes that you need to be familiar with in order to create observational drawings. Today we're going to learn another fundamental technique or trick or tool, and that is how to measure things that you see in front of you. The picture you're looking at is a still life drawing. A still life drawing is a fancy term that just means you're looking at something in real life that's in front of you that's sitting still while you draw it. Now, I personally don't like using the term still life drawing because that describes the subject of what you're drawing, but it doesn't describe the method you're using to draw it. I prefer using the term observational drawing. That tells you how you're making it. You are observing something and drawing what you see. Notice that these pictures use a wide range of values like we talked about in last week's video. They have light areas, they have dark areas, they have medium areas, they have really bright white areas, they have really dark black areas. In both of these pictures, we see shapes that are accurate to the way they look in real life. How do we achieve that as an artist? We use our pencil and our thumb to measure. Notice this illustration of a man holding out his arm at arm's length with his pencil in his hand, and he's sliding his thumb side to side and using the thumb and the end of the pencil as a measuring device. It is important when you do this that you don't do this. If I have my pencil close to my face, then it appears much larger to me. If I hold it farther out, it appears a little smaller. It is important that you always, when you're measuring, hold your arm at arm's length. Do this with me right now. Hold your arm out all the way and slide your thumb up and down like this. Close one eye, pick an object across the room. I'm looking at a doorknob, which is sideways. So I'm turning my hand sideways. And I'm going to measure how long that doorknob is. It's from the tip of the eraser to the tip of my thumb. That's how long it is. Wow, that's a really tiny doorknob, isn't it? Is the doorknob really that tiny? No, it just looks that tiny because it's all the way across the room, and as things get farther away, they look smaller. Now, I've measured that with my arm outstretched. If I bring my arm back and I make the measurement now, oh man, now it's smaller than the eraser. That's why it's important to always keep your arm stretched all the way out. That's if you're looking at an object in real life nearby, like a door or a person or a bucket or something that's in the room with you, or if you're outdoors, a tree or a plant or something. But if you're measuring on a piece of paper, then what you want to do is actually hold the the pencil right there on the paper while you're measuring. So if I'm measuring these objects, how wide is this sphere? It's from the tip of the eraser to the tip of my thumb. That's how wide it is, right? In addition to these measuring techniques where we're using a pencil to measure sizes and directions and angles, we also need to remember our value scales from last week. We're going to make sure that in all of our still life drawings, we use this full range of value. And we'll talk today about where each of those values will be seen in a still life drawing. Now, with this value scale, now that I know how to create those different values, I can start to draw a still life drawing. In the interest of making sure that the camera can see everything that I'm doing here, I'm going to be working on this picture. We're going to copy this picture from left to right. So you're only going to be able to see a part of it at a time, and then I'm going to move it, we'll draw that part, and then I'm going to move it and we'll draw that part. For starters, we're going to draw this cube. Now I know some of you guys are thinking, well, a cube is easy, it's just a square, right? Just draw a square and then you've got a cube. Oh, and maybe if I do this little thingy here, you know, I've got a cube. Well, okay, so, you know, that kind of works, but does it look like that cube? No. No, it doesn't. The bottom of this is horizontal. The bottom of this is diagonal. So you remember the measuring that we talked about just a bit ago? We are going to measure how long is that side of the cube. We're also going to use our pencil to measure angles. If it's horizontal, then it should be easy to just make a horizontal line. If it's vertical, then it should be easy to make a vertical. But if it's a diagonal line, like the bottom of this cube right here is a diagonal, I need to figure out what that diagonal is and move that diagonal over. And it's always a good idea to go back and double check. Just like if you were doing a math problem, you would want to double check, make sure you really got the right answer. All right, then I'm going to go back in and measure how long that side of the cube is. I made it too long, so I need to erase a little bit. See, double checking is super important. If I had made that side too long and left it too long, then the whole thing would look wrong. Okay, next. This line right here is vertical, and it comes straight from the corner of that line up. But how long is it? It's about that long. Again, I'm going to double check. Make sure I got it the right length. Good. It's vertical, we're good. 2 lines in. 800 million to go. I mean, no, not that many. This next line over here is also vertical, and it comes up from that corner of the cube. And how long is it? Measure, measure. Up there where my thumb is how long it's going to be. About here. There we go. Notice also how I'm kind of sketching these lines in loosely. I'm not pushing hard to make dark lines because I know I'm going to need to use my eraser, and if I push hard to make dark lines, I won't be able to erase when I make mistakes. Notice I said when I make mistakes. Yes, you are going to make mistakes. So am I. Every artist does. Not just artists, but every person does. It's important to keep that in mind. Nobody's perfect. Not even Vincent van Gogh, Leonardo da Vinci. Nobody's perfect. Everybody needs to have an eraser in their life. All right, now this line right here should just go from the top to the top. If I've measured everything right, then that angle should be the same as that angle. And it's a little off. I think I made this a little bit too tall. Double, triple, quadruple checking. It should be at that angle, and it should be that long. And it should be at that angle, and it should be that. There we go. Okay. So that's one face of the cube. Notice that it's not a square like we talked about before, right? It's more like a kite, like a rhombus or a parallelogram. Next, we need to pick the top or the other side. Doesn't really matter which one, so I'm just going to pick one. This line right here goes at this angle, goes at this angle. So it's going to go that direction. I've already made it too long, I can tell. I need to measure, see how long it is. Measure, see how long it is. Wow, I made it way too long. Erase the extra bits. And then this line is that long, and it's pretty much parallel to that line. Okay, so it's going to come to right about here. All right. Now, You see how I'm going back and re-measuring every single line. There are some artists who have been doing this for, 20, 30, 50 years longer. And, when you get really practiced at it, you learn how to just see the angles and the measurements. But, I've been drawing and painting and sculpting and creating artwork for about 20 years, and I still need to measure. You really got to be good to be able to see it without measuring. There are some things that I can draw without measuring, but for something like this, if I'm looking straight at it and I want it to be an exact copy of what I'm looking at, I'm going to measure it, every single line. It takes time, but the result is worth it, trust me. All right, now, so I've got one more line coming down this way. Is vertical, it's vertical, it's vertical. It just comes straight down. And then I've got one more line that angles. Let's make sure we get that angle. Oh, it should be the same angle as the top up there. It should come this direction. And that means that wherever these two lines cross each other should be the right place for the end of that cube. So let's measure that and see how it turned out. Measured, measured. I made it a little too long, and I think that's because my vertical line kind of goes a little bit off to the side. This needs to come more straight down. And there we go. Let's measure that again. Measure it, perfect. Measure that, perfect. We'll come back and talk about the shadow in just a minute. First, let's apply some shading to the cube itself. When we're talking about shading an object, we have the lighted side, we have the midtone side, and we have the shadowed side. The lighted side in this case was the top of the cube because the light was shining directly from above onto the top of the cube. So, the top of the cube is so brightly lit, it's going to be a value of 0. That means I should not do any shading at all on the top section of the cube. The right-hand side, as you can see here from this picture, was the midtone side of the cube. Notice it's a middle value. It's not as dark as that side, right? This side should be a value of 1. How did I make the 1? I held my pencil all the way back at the back, let it rest sideways, and just very gently rub the pencil against the page. Next, this side right here should be a value of 2. How did I make that? Instead of holding my pencil like a kindergarten grip, I flipped my thumb under and around so that the pencil is resting near my wrist, and I pulled back a little ways so that I can apply a little bit of pressure, but not much. And doing that makes this side of the cube a little bit darker, but not super dark. This is a value of 2. Now notice that I still have not gone and darkened the line between the two sides. The contrast between the lighter shading and the darker shading makes that side visible for us. We don't need to draw a dark line there. In fact, the only place we do need a dark line is what's called an occlusion shadow. So let's talk about cast shadows and all the different parts of a cast shadow next. In the case of this shadow, the light was shining directly from above that cube, and so the shadow kind of spread out in every direction except for behind it because the light kind of overhung behind the cube. So right here in front of the cube, there's a little gap where the cube and the desk are so close together that light just can't shine into that gap between them. That's called an occlusion shadow, and that's the only part where you should hold your pencil like a kindergarten grip and really push it in super dark. Right there along that bottom edge where the object meets its cast shadow. That is going to be the darkest shading we see in the entire picture, what's called an occlusion shadow. Occlusion is just a fancy word that means shielding or blocking. So it's like there's something there that stops the light from coming in, right? Next, notice that this line in the shadow continues the same direction as the bottom of the cube. So I can continue this line on in this direction. And then this edge of the shadow is parallel. And then this edge of the shadow is actually parallel to this side right here. It just comes out from that corner. And then from back here, there's another line on the back edge of the shadow that comes to about halfway up the side of the cube. So about halfway up the side of the cube. And it's again parallel to these lines down here. And then one more line in that shadow from this corner. Now, why are all of these lines here? Because when light shines down on this cube, well, the light's shining in this direction, so this is going to be the darkest part of the shadow, but the light kind of spreads as it goes over, and so some of that light falls over the edge and into this side of the shadow, and same on the other edge into this side of the shadow, leaving this side of the shadow being the darkest because the light was kind of a little further this direction. Okay, so this part of the shadow is not going to be a number 4 value. We've already got the occlusion here. It's actually going to be a number 3. How did we get that? With our finger on the tip of our pencil like this. Now, if you've applied that pressure adequately, then you should see that the cast shadow is darker than the shadowed side of the cube. These extra bits of the shadow are going to be a number 2 value, which is the same as the shadowed side of the cube. How did we do that? We held our pencil about halfway back. We did the same thing as the 3, but instead of pushing down here, we were pushing down here. And that should be the same value as this side of the cube, which makes it kind of disappear. That line between them kind of disappears. We'll come back and talk about that in just a second. Let's get this side. And before we come back to talk about this, I just want to mention one more time, notice how the darkest part of the shadow is right at the base of the cube, and it gets a little lighter as it comes out. That's because the light disperses and, bounces around off of lots of different things around the room. And so the darkest part is going to be right there at the edge, and then it's going to get lighter as it moves out. Now, right here, I could, if I wanted to be cartoony, I could draw a dark outline straight down on that side of the cube. But that's not what I see in real life. In real life, that side of the cube does almost blend in with that shadow next to it. However, there's something called reflected light. So there's light in this room coming from lots of different sources. When I drew this, it was just coming from here because I turned off all the other lights. But even if the light is just coming from here, that light is going to spread around the room. It's going to bounce off of lots of different things. It'll bounce off of the ceiling. It'll bounce off of the walls. It'll bounce off of the table. It'll bounce off of lots of things. And so even though the primary source of light is shining from here down on the top, there's also some ambient light being reflected in lots of different directions, and it's going to come up into whatever side of that cube is shadowed. So here, on that shadowed side of the cube, not on the cast shadow under the cube, but on the side of the cube, I'm going to pull out with my eraser a little bit of a highlight right there along that edge. That's the reflected light. And you see how that right there is enough contrast to let it be where you can see that side of the cube, even though it's right next to a shadow that's the same value as that side of the cube? So that's it for the cube. Now we need to move on to the cone and the sphere. So let's get these outlines in first and then start shading these. What we want to start with is looking at where the cone overlaps behind the cube. Since we've already drawn the cube, we want to see where that overlaps and interacts with the cone. So if we start with the corner of the cube here and we go up a little ways, well, it's about that high up where the cone comes out from underneath, out from behind. And if we measure from the top down, it's about that far down where the cone comes out from underneath that way, out from behind it that way. I think I'm going to need to erase this cube I drew up here for no reason so that I have enough space to make sure this cone goes where it needs to go. Let's look at the angle. Make sure I get the angle right. Let's measure the length. And I'm going to measure it to the cube. Some people like to measure it as if you could see through the cube. I'm going to measure it to where it intersects with the cube. Okay, so it should be up about that high. And then I'm going to measure how wide the cube is. How wide the cone is. Now here, I am going to try to imagine where it goes behind the sphere. And so it's about that far. It's about that far right there. And that's a curve. So it's kind of hard to measure the angle of a curve, right? It's a curve, so it curves. It's not an angle. But I'm going to do my best to try to mimic the curviness of that curve, right? You don't want it to bump way too far down, and you don't want it to be too flat either. Okay? Next, I'm going to measure how wide the top of that cone is. It's a truncated cone. It's not a pointy cone, right? So there's where the oval at the top of the cone is going to be that wide. And then at this angle, yeah, perfect. It should go from the edge of that oval to the bottom corner over here. Perfect. Okay. Then I'm going to have to erase this bottom corner because it's behind this sphere. Now I need to measure how big is that sphere and how far up and how far over on this cone does it intersect. So I'm going to measure the distance from the cube to the sphere, move that over here. I need to erase from there over. And I'm also going to measure the distance from the top of the sphere to the top of the cone. Measure that far down. I need to erase from here. Okay, now I know that my sphere is going to intersect here and intersect here. I want to get sort of a top, bottom, left, and right so that I can draw that sphere the right size. So I'm going to sort of measure how tall that sphere is. Comes to about here at the bottom. And I want to measure how wide is that sphere. All right, so that at least gets me sort of a couple of placements where I know I want to draw a circle that goes through those points. And drawing circles is difficult. It's difficult to do accurately. It's difficult to draw perfect circles. I mean, if I had a compass, even then it would be a little difficult because, you know, using a compass, you have to find the center and then swing around. So really, just sketch it out the best you can and then erase any extra bits hanging out that too far or, you know, whatever. Just get it done the best you can. All right, then we're going to figure out the outline of these shadows. If we look at the sphere, you notice that it's got this sort of swoosh between the highlighted side and the shadowed side, and it almost looks like a Pepsi symbol. And if we look where the sphere intersects with the cone, we go straight down from there. Straight down from there is where that sort of swooshy thing starts. And straight over from here is where that swooshy thing ends. And then it's sort of a diagonal in between, a diagonal curve in between. And then if we look at the cone, we can see there's it's clearly darker on this side and lighter on this side, and you could also imagine there's a line here between the light and shadow, and that goes right about there. Now that is not going to be a distinct line, it's going to be a gradient from dark to light. We'll talk about gradients in just a second. Next, we want this oval-shaped shadow under the sphere. Notice that that starts just underneath the Pepsi swoosh, here, and then pretty much straight across from there. And the oval goes that direction, right? It points that way. So I want it to point that way. And how long is that oval going to be? Let's sort of measure. I'm going to measure from where it intersects with the circle here to the end of the shadow there. That's how long that oval should be. Again, it's always a good idea to go back and double check, triple check, measure, measure, measure. Drawing a still life is more about measuring and seeing than it is about drawing and shading. And the last outline we need is the outline of this shadow, the cast shadow of the cone. Notice that it starts here, right above the Pepsi swoosh on the sphere, right above that. And that far up on the side of the cone, there. And it goes in that direction, that far. So, in that direction, that far. And it's sort of almost pointy, except it ends up being round at the end because the top of the cone is round. It's not a pointy cone. Now, you might be wondering why all the shadows are going different directions, and that's because when I drew this, the light was kind of in between all three objects. Now, if the light was off to one side, the shadows would all go that way. If the light was off to that side, the shadows would all go this way. If the light was in front of me, the shadows would all go behind me. If the light was behind me, all the shadows would go in front. But in this case, because the light is kind of in the middle, the shadows all spread out in different directions. All right, so now it's as simple as a color by number. We just want to put these different values where they belong in these different shapes. And the only part of that that's going to be difficult is right here with the cone. We're going to have a gradient. So let's start with that, and then it'll just be easy pickings from there on. Notice that on this cone, it's not like you've got a dark side and a light side and a line in between them. You see how the value shade transitions from dark to medium to light kind of smoothly instead of having a line in between like here? To do that, what we want to do is, and you can work either way, from dark to light or light to dark. And I personally like to work from light to dark, because it's always easier to make something darker than it is to make something lighter. So what I'm going to do is start by leaving this side completely paper white, and I'm going to very faintly number 1 shade from the, leaving a white gap and then shade number 1 style as I move across. And I want to slowly transition that number 1 into a number 2. So I'm slowly moving my hand further up the pencil as I go. And I'm slowly applying more and more pressure as I move my hand up that pencil. But for now, I'm still way back here. And by the time I reach this line, I should be right around a number 2 value. And then I should be transitioning to applying some pressure with that finger on top of the pencil as the pencil is resting sideways underneath my hand. And I'm working my finger up towards the tip to where by the time I reach this edge, I will be at a number 3. But still not like this, still not a number 4. The number 4 for the cone is only going to be just one tiny little groove right here at the bottom of the cone, right here, just right there, one tiny little line. That actually is going to be seen as an outline, because where that cone rests onto the surface underneath it, there is a gap, just like between my 2 fingers, there's a little gap that light just doesn't shine through that gap, so it makes a dark line. But there's not going to be a dark line outlining above and around up here, because those are just open in the air. They're not right next to another object. I'm going to clean up the outside edge of that a little bit so I have a nice clean line. And the top of the cone here is sort of in between the 1 and the 2 values, so just kind of get a little bit of shading up in there, but not too dark. And if you can do that, then all the rest of this is pretty much simple. The cast shadow from the cone is going to be a number 3 value. So I'm flipping my pencil sideways. And right here, where it meets the edge of the cone, we might do the same thing we did here on the cube. We'll come back and see if it needs that here in just a second. I'm going to start with a number 3 value, getting it nice and dark. and I'm going to make it lighter as it moves out away from the object. Kind of like that. And I could come in here and pull out a tiny little bit of reflected light on that side right there where it meets the cast shadow. Totally up to you whether you do that or not. It does kind of give it a little bit more contrast there. And for the sphere, the highlighted side, I'm going to shade that whole highlighted side with number one value. I hold my pencil all the way back and just let gravity do the work as I wiggle the pencil around. And I'm going to shade that whole section in with a number 1, even though there should be like a paper white highlight right there where I'm pointing. I'm going to shade the whole thing in with that number 1 value. Then I'm going to use my eraser and pull out right there at the edge of the sphere. Pull that highlight out. And then this section here is going to be more like a number 2 value, just like the dark side of the cube. So shade that just a little bit darker from that line down. Notice though how I am working that shadow even darker as I come towards the bottom edge of it. The shadowed side, because just like with the cone, a sphere is round, we're going to have a gradient, right? So it's going to get darker as it comes down. But it's not going to get to a full number 4 push down like a gorilla dark. That will be reserved for the occlusion shadow, part of the cast shadow underneath the sphere. So let's go ahead and do that now. Let's get that in first. That'll be the darkest part of that shadow. And then the rest of that shadow will be a number 3. So I'm pushing down, but not with my gorilla grip, not with my kindergarten grip, not with my make it as dark as I possibly can grip. Working with my sideways grip. My finger on top of the pencil grip. And I do just want to make sure that that dark occlusion shadow is even darker than the rest of the cast shadow. And then as I work out, now I'm going to rotate my paper because it's easier to shade this way. As I do work out to the end of this shadow, it is going to get a little lighter to more like a number 2 value. Congratulations, you have finished your first attempt at a still life drawing. Just to recap what we've learned today, we talked about measuring angles and measuring lengths using a pencil, and then comparing those lengths to other parts of our picture and those angles to other parts of our picture. And we also focused on where we see each of these values in a still life drawing. These skills are going to really help next week as we dive into learning how to create different textures of the things that we see in front of us. Can't wait to see you then.